Global warming, how serious is it? Next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus, the Institute of World Affairs weekly television program. I'm Ben Merens of Wisconsin Public Radio, sitting in for Rob Rosigliano. In today's program, we'll look at changes in climate and the impact of an eroding ozone layer. With the recent enactment of the Kyoto Accord, an environmental agreement to which the United States has declined to join, global warming has become an issue that warrants further discussion, and we'll bring you that discussion today. Our guests are two University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee scientists who study global warming. Professor of Geography at UW-M, Mark Schwartz, is a synoptic climatologist whose primary research interest is plant-climate interactions during the onset of spring. Paul Roebber is a professor of UW-M's Atmospheric Science Group in the Department of Mathematical Sciences. Professor Roebber's research also focuses on planetary climate dynamics. Gentlemen, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you.
When we talk about global warming, in a recent edition of National Geographic, big headline, global warming, and underneath they have a picture of trees burning, as if to tell you the world's on fire. Is it that dramatic?
I think that the evidence has become clear, particularly in the decade of the 90s, that we have seen an increase of temperatures that is unprecedented. If you look at the record back, particularly if you go back before the last century, the temperatures that we have seen are much greater. But it's important to put this into context of what we're talking about. We're talking about average temperatures, and there is always a tendency in a lot of the media events to relate this to the most recent weather, you know, a very hot summer or a very cold winter, and ask the question. And it's a broader thing that needs to be considered than just that.
When we talk about average temperatures and impact on the globe, and we look at how many people are now on the globe, is there a connection to how many of us exist and where the average temperatures are, and whether or not we should be concerned about them going up because the population's gone up?
I'd like to step back for a second and just define what we mean by global warming.
That's a good
I think
idea.
it's important to clarify that. Oftentimes when people talk about global warming, they make the automatic connection to human-induced climate change, and I think it's important to separate out, first of all, warming. Secondly, what's the cause of the warming?
Okay.
Is there warming? I think the preponderance of evidence now suggests there really is. There was some discussion about, some debate about that just a few years ago. I think it's pretty clear at this point from a variety of sources that that is going on. So the more fundamental question now is, what is the cause of that warming? Is it just a natural cycle, part of the climate variability that we've observed for the entire climatic record, or is it something that's fairly recent and as a result of human-induced changes?
I guess another question along with that people wonder about is there a downside to it? Are we suffering because there's warming?
I think that the primary consideration is the rate of change. As I said before, climate has always changed and always will change, and there are natural cycles that force that. And if you look at very long timescales, you see that the climate has changed very dramatically over the history that we can measure that. I think the issue here is that the rate of change appears to be very strong, very rapid, and how fast can societies adjust to those kinds of changes that are going to result from that, I think, is really the issue that we're facing now.
You say the rate of change has picked up. What do we see to study and mark that?
Well, in the natural world, for example, the things that I've looked at in terms of the time that plants are leafing and flowering. Now, you first think, well, so what does that really impact? But one of the things, particularly in the beginning of the season, say in the middle latitudes, this is connected with the whole ecosystem structure. So if the plants are blossoming earlier, the insects have to be prepared to take advantage of them earlier, and if the insects can't do that, then there could be problems. Then when the insects appear, affects when the birds and other mammals have them available for food, and the rate of change that Paul was talking about is part of the structure, because if it's very gradual, the animals perhaps could migrate or have some other kind of adaptation but they may not be able to if the change is very fast, and it could affect which species in a particular area are successful.
Is there any evidence that they're suffering from this as opposed to adapting?
There is some evidence that some animals aren't able to adapt to this. Say different birds aren't able to nest in an area successfully, aren't able to bring their eggs to a successful hatching, those kinds of things. But there are a lot of issues of this sort where we're seeing the changes taking place, and we need to be able to put this into a context, and obviously people want to know what's the impact back to them, and there are a lot of issues of this sort, and that's one of the complexities of this issue.
One of the other areas people talk about when they say, well, global warming is going on, and we know it because you can look at the polar ice caps and they're melting. How do we measure that, and what kind of melting are they talking about?
Well, I think in the National Geographic article that you referenced earlier, they did talk about the thinning of the Arctic sea ice, and I think that's one of the particular elements that are very persuasive in terms of indicating that global change is occurring. The fact that you can measure something like that and show it. I'm not actually aware of the technical details of how they're measuring that. I don't know, Mark, do you have some information about that?
I suspect that much of that's being done by satellite observation, but again, I don't know.
Well, I mean, technically,
the
how they're
basic
measuring
detail.
versus when they're talking about, well, there's 30% less or 80% less, whatever the percentage of polar ice cap that is gone away. Some people scratch their heads and say, so what? Why should I worry about that? Other people say we should worry about it, but what can we do about it?
One of the issues as far as polar melting is concerned that actually, again, illustrates the complexity of the climate is the fact that a lot of the climate is driven by the ocean circulation, particularly the deep ocean circulation. It's called the thermohaline circulation. And for example, if you look at latitudes in North America and similar latitudes in Europe, you find that the European locations are much warmer. And the reason for that is there's a tremendous amount of heat that's transported north by the deep ocean circulation, so Europe is the beneficiary of that. So, for example, if you look in Scandinavian countries, their winters, although they're dark, are significantly warmer than northern Canada, similar latitudes, but much colder. So the deep ocean circulation has a very strong modifying influence on the climate, and one of the real concerns, and a genuine concern, is if this melting occurs in the polar ice cap, that introduces a lot of fresh water into the ocean, which is now less dense than it was before. This overturning circulation stops, and that transport to the north stops. So ironically, one of the impacts of global warming could be cooling in northern latitudes.
Well, it would seem if that's the case, then it's not having this dramatic heat-up effect in totality. So the concern that we're going to overheat at some point may be overstated. There are people who say this isn't even an issue. It's something, before we get to our first break, I want to ask you both about the debate. Some people say, well, it's clear like debating the world is round or flat. Is it that clear to you?
I think it's very clear that the changes are happening, and I think that one of the issues and the thing that Paul was talking about is clearly an aspect of this, but more variability, more kinds of oscillations is another potential thing. That's probably one of the more difficult things to ascertain, because people will look at this and think, every day is going to be warmer, and like what I was referring to before, that's not really the way this is going to happen. We're changing the energy input. I mean, if we kind of step back from this, when I talk with students about this, I say you should look at it from the point of view of what we know and what we don't know. And we do know that when you put more of these gases into the atmosphere, that allows more energy to be retained in the system. And we're seeing some of that manifested in terms of the temperatures at the surface, but it isn't necessarily going to be manifested everywhere in the same way, nor is that energy going to be smooth and an easy transition. So we may have a period of time and different places that don't manifest the change, but that doesn't mean that the whole system isn't getting poised perhaps for some kind of more major, perhaps nonlinear change in the future. And that's sort of at the bounds of the scientific understanding of what's going on, is to try to get at what could happen there. But that's very difficult. We can simulate it with models, but the atmosphere is very complex. But that isn't to minimize the idea that the overall warming is still taking place, and that forcing, as we call about it, from the atmospheric increases in CO2 still isn't there.
Do you look at this as a problem that A, exists, and more importantly, B, can't be reversed?
To some extent, the horse is already out of the barn. We've emitted CO2 for a long period of time. The increase in concentration is very easily measured and has been measured for a long time. We know it exists. There's a question of what the higher end impact is, and if we were to limit emissions at this point, what would be the overall impact? Clearly there'd still be an impact. We can't stop what we've already emitted. However, we can perhaps reduce the impact by controlling emissions in the future. That was the idea of the Kyoto Protocol, was to try to minimize impacts in the future.
Now, there's some people say the Kyoto Protocol basically is just a drop in the bucket, and it's the impact you'll have to have. I think I read somebody said you need 50 type Kyoto protocols to really have an impact over time.
Well,
what does the Kyoto Protocol call for?
Well, in terms of the actual impact on the emissions, I think that's probably right, that it would not have a great deal of change. It certainly wouldn't reduce emissions. I think of it as along the lines of, the old saw of a journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. If there's going to be any kind of international sort of effort to look at this, there needs to be some kind of way to have collaboration between the various countries. And overall, Kyoto is not anything other than just trying to start that process. And the next steps are where this gets very difficult, because it's hard to look at our society, to look at the amount of CO2 that we're emitting and say, how do we reduce this? Most of the scenarios don't talk about reducing the amount of gas. They talk about limiting how much more is going to end this. So I look at it as Paul was saying, we've bought our ticket and we're going for a ride, and the question is how much more bumps there are going to be along the way, and I think the more gases that get put into the atmosphere, the more we build up the potential for there to be more changes. I've talked about this in terms of sort of like when one buys insurance. You don't buy insurance because you expect bad things to happen, but you do it because you're trying to minimize the chance that if things do go bad, you have some way to fall back on them. And right now, we're really not even buying the insurance policy. We're just going along and saying, let's hope it all works out.
I'm Ben Merens, in for Rob Sigliano. We're talking about global warming with Mark Schwartz and Paul Roebber, both of University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, both scientists, warning us that we should be paying attention to the signs and signals about global warming. We're going to take a quick break and come back, and we'll talk some more. Please stay with us.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
So glad you're watching International Focus as we focus on global warming. When we talk about global warming, we're talking with Mark Schwartz today, by the way, and Paul Roebber from UWM. When we talk about global warming, some people want to know if we are inducing the global warming because we're putting pollutants in the air, or because we're cutting down trees and we're shifting waterways, so we're basically affecting the nature side of things. When you try to dissect what's causing it, we've started the program with that, we'll come back to it, is a lot of that because we're putting pollutants into the air, or we're taking the trees out?
Well, first of all, I think there still is some debate as to whether or not it is human-induced climatic warming. The evidence recently, I think, is pretty convincing, especially some of the climate simulations, which are now capable of representing current and past conditions quite well in terms of the trends of temperature. And they indicate quite clearly that this is human-induced. And as you said, there are two components to that. There's what you might think of as the urbanization aspect. So if you look at weather stations that have been taking long-term temperature measurements in urban areas, you'll find that quite often those are areas that are subject to considerable amount of warming, and that's associated with change from more rural environments to urban environments over long periods of time. And the second aspect is the more global component associated with the greenhouse gas emissions. So there really are two aspects, both of which appear to be contributing to the warming.
And when we talk about your focus on the onset of spring and the warming, a lot of people say, I'd like winter to end earlier. And if we have less winter and a longer spring, we have the spring of many of our childhoods. So we're coming through a cycle here. Why do you look at it that way?
Well, in North America, where I've looked most recently, there has been, there's really a couple of ways to think about it. If we start from the beginning of the century until about, say the 50s, there is no discernible trend, but say from the late 50s to the present, there is a trend for things to get earlier, say about a week earlier over that 35 to 40 year period, but it's quite variable. As a sort of, I warn some people because they'll say, oh, should I plant my garden earlier or can I? And it's not that kind of change, because it isn't change that necessarily means that every spring is going to be earlier, because there's still a tremendous amount of variability, and 1 year to the next can still have, say, up to 10 days or 2 weeks of variation, so we can still have very cool ones. So it's a long-term trend, not something where it's saying just like I was saying, every day isn't going to be warmer because of global warming.
We talked earlier about the fact that it's not just that you're seeing a warming trend, but the speed with which things have changed. If you look in the last 50 to 100 years versus prior to that, if you go out looking at the next 50 to 100 years, is there any way this could slow down? And if it did, would you be less concerned than you are if you see current trends continue?
I would be very surprised, like to see it, but for that things would slow down. Now, I mean, that's based on the premise that this is anthropogenic warming. I think the question is more, what will ultimately the rise be? There's this range of variation between about 2 degrees and some of the more recent things up to 10 degrees, and I always sort of, getting back to the probability or the insurance kind of approach, think that the likelihood is that neither of the extreme scenarios are probably going to happen. It's going to be something in between, but then it's a question of where you are. There undoubtedly will be some places that will have benefits because of being warmer, but to say that then there aren't going to be places that aren't going to have serious problems, or there are going to be problems overall, is overstating it as well.
For the general public who hears some of these discussions and for the most part scratch their heads, they've got dinner to get to, the bills to pay, and taxes and the like, and global warming is a little bit too much for us. But if we're wondering, where is this going to go generations from now? If things don't change, given your studies, do you expect that we'll flame out as a populace here? Humans won't exist because of this?
I find it hard to believe that an extreme scenario like that would emerge. I think there would be significant repercussions, particularly for societies that are less able to adapt because of poverty issues and those kinds of problems. I think Western societies are probably the most capable of adapting to those kinds of changes. So, we are probably, as the United States, one of the primary contributors to the warming. We're also probably one of the places that is most able to cope with that warming if it does occur. So,
in impoverished areas, why would the people be?
It's simply the kind of approaches that you have to take to cope require resources, and we have resources and those areas don't. It's as simple as that.
And there's a big connection here. You were talking earlier about the populations and about development, because looking back at this from the point of view of, well, if we would like everyone else in the world to be able to have a higher standard of living, they can't follow the path that we took in the past, or this problem is going to become so profound that there'll be no argument about it. The amount of CO2 that would be emitted if China brought all of their population up, if India brought all their population up, burned all their coal reserves, that's, in my mind, really where the issue lies. It's not so much where we're at right now, but how much more additional gas is there going to be, and the fact that this is tied to development and raising living standards around the world. That's where this gets to be really difficult.
Well, it appears right now, anyway, with the development of places like the consumer middle class of China and all the onslaught of the cars they're all driving, and that we're not giving up our cars here. The trends are that we're going to continue to pollute and put more of a stress on the atmosphere. So if that's a given, what does that tell you in terms of what you'll study, see, and what we can expect?
Well, in terms of what I'm looking at, I am expecting things to continue to change because there are natural cycles along with the anthropogenic.
Is the change necessarily bad?
Well, again, it depends on.
I mean, for nature.
Well, in terms of nature, I think yes. One of the other issues about animals and nature is it used to be when climate change took place and there were no human settlements or other things involved, animals migrated, plants slowly redistributed themselves. Now we created a bunch of preserves. And sort of implicit in the idea of these preserves is that the climate is stable. And over the long term, these areas where the plants and animals say are, and not just in the preserves but other areas, they may not be able to survive there, and also they're not as easily able to move from one place to the other when we're talking about animals. So that could be an impact in terms of survival and strategies.
But maybe we made a mistake with the preserves, but we'll shift where we live and how we live anyway.
I think also there's a political dimension to this that goes beyond the science, which when you talk about resource-intensive societies like ours and those who have less access to resources, I think there's a political instability that is easy to imagine arising in that kind of situation. So to my mind, I think there are technical fixes that you can do to a lot of these things if you have the resources. But the political issue, I think, is perhaps one that people are going to have to grapple with more than anything else in the future.
And with all the issues on the table for the politicians in this country and across the globe, global warming isn't necessarily at the top of the list, and many people in the science community certainly are crying out for more attention to be paid to it. If the political leaders and the governmental leaders don't pay attention to it, is there a way you see the people in the world doing something around them?
Well, I think the problem is that, again, as Mark has mentioned several times, it's a slow process, a slow time scale, and then other things can always seem more urgent. Mm-hmm. And there's a tendency, as Mark also indicated earlier, that people will ascribe significant weather events to global warming, which is clearly incorrect. But it's a way of drawing attention to those issues.
So the hurricane season, tsunami.
So those kinds of issues, you cannot assign any of those kinds of instances to global warming. It's really a different problem. And that makes it very hard to draw attention to the issue when it's a slow, gradual process over timescales that are much longer than a political office would entail, 4 years or 8 years or anything like that. So it becomes very difficult politically to deal with those kinds of issues.
If you can wrap I've in some of my classes with the students attempted back to the idea of trying to wrap this. It's all interconnected. If you development and sort of trying to raise standards of living issues, if you can look at some of these things and say, well, we don't need to do this just because of global warming. We need to do this because it's going to solve a local pollution problem. It's going to give us more energy independence because we won't be reliant on oil. Oil is going to eventually run out in the long term. We need alternatives. Right now, we're not really exploring any of those strategies. And I always like to try to say we can link these to other reasons. Because if you were just to go out and say we need to do all of this because of global warming, I think it would be a pretty hard sell. But the idea is to try to start processes, and this is where it may be able to be achieved politically, where you can link it to other kinds of objectives and tie it in, because I think it would be a pretty hard sell, and that's why Kyoto, I think, probably wasn't really very palatable or acceptable to the people in the U.S. government. Although
countries all over the world had no problem accepting.
Well, I'm not a political scientist, so I won't wade into those waters.
Well, talking about water, because I want to get back to that before we wrap this hour up, segment up, and that is the sea levels are discussed constantly too, about measuring, what the depth of the oceans, and you look at where Lake Michigan comes to the shore, and people say, well, see, it's not as deep there as it used to be, and that's global warming too, is it?
Well, that's because of that dredging over near Detroit. Is why is the latest thing of why the lake levels are going down. But that's
As a kid, I was told Lake Michigan has cycles.
It certainly does.
Yeah, it does.
7-year cycles, but now I'm told the cycles have shifted, and people point to global warming for it.
Yeah. Well, there may be something going on in terms of large-scale precipitation, but the article that I read just recently suggested that there's some dredging that was done over in the area around Detroit in the river there that connects Lake Huron and Lake Erie is why perhaps our lake level here has been going down, because the relative level of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron relative to Lake Erie has been reduced, whereas in the past all the lakes changed in sequence, and if it was being caused solely by climate change, you would expect them to all change in sequence. So that one, there is perhaps a larger cycle, and it's true that the lakes go through that cycle, but there are other things going on as well.
Mark Schwartz and Paul Roebber, thanks so much. We could talk for a couple more hours about this. We don't have the time today, but I appreciate you taking time to join us.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thank you for watching International Focus. For Robert Sigliano, I'm Ben Merens, and we hope to see you next week.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.